The City of Tacoma's Historic Preservation Office, in association with Pretty Gritty Tours, presents Tacoma Noir.
Ray Rook walked slowly up the steps of the Pinkerton building. What had once been the Massasoit Hotel had been gutted by the Vice Squad and turned over as a temporary headquarters for the largest detective agency in the U.S. With labor strikes, organized crime, and increasing wealth being generated by the railroad, it wasn't uncommon to see Pinkertons walking the streets these days. They had a reputation for being excellent private detectives and professional private security. Ray knew from previous dealings with the Pinkertons that they had earned the reputation, every ounce of it. On either side of Ray, he was flanked by the two Pinkertons who had cornered him a moment earlier. The third, who had pulled the gun on him, had broken off when they started walking, and Ray could only assume he was nearby, out of sight. The shorter of the two Pinkertons, who escorted him, was an athletic man in his 30s, probably former military, with a slight hitch in his step and a muscular build. Ray knew him as Detective Alan Steele. They had worked similar cases for the wealthy citizens of Tacoma over the years. Alan Steele's loyalty was to the Pinkerton agency and big enterprise. Ray's loyalty was something even he couldn't track down these days. The first detective, Alan Steele, turned to speak to Ray.
Let's step inside, Rook. We need to have a conversation about what you've stepped into.
The other Pinkerton was taller than Alan Steele by a couple inches, but had the look of a man one step in his grave. His gaunt features and thin frame loosely supported the fine Pinkerton uniform that hung from him like clothes on a scarecrow. His eyes, however, were clear and lively, dark shadows that burned underneath his stitched brow. He wore his hair brushed back and close cut. Ray wasn't familiar with this one, hadn't seen him around town yet.
All right, boys. I'm willing to hear you out, but you should know, I'm expensive to hire.
The taller Pinkerton shoved Ray forward towards the building abruptly.
Larry, ease up. Ray won't be any trouble. Will you, Ray?
This guy thinks he's somebody. As far as we know, he did the murder.
You will need to have some patience with Detective Larry Hendelson here, Ray. He is one of the most celebrated detectives employed by the Pinkerton's National Detective Agency. He burns a little hot, though. He just came to us from breaking up labor unions in Montana and hasn't quite adjusted to life here in Tacoma yet.
We have enough trouble with the police muddying the waters on this one. We don't need any other loose ends tipping people off and getting in the middle of our job.
Alan Steele laughed a little under his breath as he stepped forward and opened the door for Ray. Ray Rook entered the stately former lobby of the Pinkerton building and saw that it had been converted into a makeshift bullpen with a row of typists taking notes as couriers dropped heavy paper packages on each desk. The women at the desks were assembling thick documents into folders before having them sent back out. On the wall, overlooking it all, was the large Pinkerton National Detective Agency logo, an unblinking eye with "We Never Sleep" boldly scrolled beneath it. Larry Hendelson reached for a silver case of cigarettes in his pocket and took one out.
Mind if I grab one of those from you? I didn't have time to pick any up on the corner before our surprise expedition downtown.
Larry Hendelson studied Ray for a moment before handing him a hand-rolled cigarette and keeping one for himself. Ray Rook took out his lighter and lit the cigarette before inhaling deeply.
Now that is a new flavor for me. What is this?
Blue Boar. I developed a taste for it over in Spokane. The rail crews coming back from the war had brought it back.
Fine stuff. I might have to find some here in Tacoma, too.
Let's step into my office, Ray. Larry and I have some questions for you.
The three men went up a short flight of stairs and into what appeared to be a former hotel room converted into an office. Two desks sat in the middle of the room with a small electric heater on the edge of the room. An ashtray lay in the middle of it all, stacked high with ash and bits of paper and tobacco. Larry Hendelson finished his cigarette and tore the stub into tiny pieces and sprinkled them into the ashtray. Alan Steele removed his coat with its fine brass buttons and hung it up by the door. His Colt .38, apparently the favorite piece for Pinkerton detectives, lay close against his chest in its holster, coiled like a rattlesnake. He walked over to the larger of the two desks and took a seat. He motioned for Ray to have a seat on a wooden chair next to the desk. Detective Larry Hendelson leaned against the opposite wall, catching his breath, standing as if the entire journey had taken a toll on him. His suspicious eyes never left Ray Rook's face. They clung to his features like a magnet.
How'd you get wrapped up in this, Ray?
You're gonna have to be more specific. You guys are doing the questions and kidnapping people off the streets.
Don't get smart. We've been working this case for a month, and out of the blue you fly in and start poking around the safe. What's your interest in the railroad?
Railroad, huh? Is that what this is about?
You know damn well what this is about. Did you take the service order? We didn't find it at the foreman's office, and it didn't just jump out on its own.
Ray Rook took a moment to slowly finish the last of his cigarette, before looking around the room as if he was distracted. Say, boys, that reminds me. When we're done here, I have to stop in at the bank. Maybe along the way you could tell me where to find more of that Blue Boar tobacco. I admit I'm no good at rolling my own, but there's always time to learn new skills.
Ray, was it the police that got you involved with this? I don't think you understand the depth that you're swimming in.
I can confirm that is often the case. Of course, I'm an excellent swimmer.
Alan Steele sat across from Ray Rook and measured the man with his eyes.
Why were you there at the Scandinavian Bank building this morning?
I'll tell you. I got a job to find a woman's husband. Simple as that.
Did you find him?
As a matter of fact, I did. He was the gentleman who the police found this morning. Detective Byrne asked me to follow up on the case. Sammy was his name, I think.
You were looking for this Sammy guy?
Ray Rook stopped for a moment.
Sam Glenn, that was his name. Yeah. Well, I suppose now that I found him, I'll just get paid and this will all be done. Unless, of course, you think the two cases are connected somehow.
Not that it seems. We are chasing a Peterman who has been blowing safes in Montana and western Washington. As long as you're just looking into disappearing husbands, you shouldn't mind staying away from the Washington building for a while.
Ray shrugged and did his best to continue playing dumb. He noted that the Pinkertons were now looking for a Peterman, a safecracker, one who specializes in using nitroglycerin to get the job done.
You should also let us know if you find anything that may be part of the railroad's business.
It would be easier to help you boys if I knew what I was looking for.
You'll help plenty, Ray, by staying out of our way.
Alan Steele looked up at Larry Hendelson and they seemed to confirm something wordlessly between them. Larry nodded slightly and Alan got up and offered his hand to Ray.
All right, Ray. Look, leave the rest of this to us. I'm glad you found your guy. I wish it had been under better circumstances. It's bad business.
Ray Rook stood up, took Alan's hand, and they shook. Ray Rook said nothing, but he thought to himself that it seemed like it was all bad business these days. He nodded to the detective, walked across the room, and exited through the door. As he went, he felt the eyes of both detectives watch him go. He stepped onto the sidewalk, trying to detect the ebb and flow of the city's currents, caught the right angle, and followed a hunch downtown.
Ray Rook quickly made his way to the local post office on A. He took several papers out of his breast pocket, stuffed them in an envelope. Addressing it and adding a stamp, he handed it to the clerk at the front desk.
Ray Rook circled the block for a couple hours to catch his own thoughts and to make sure that he hadn't been followed again.
From there, walked up the street and entered his own office building. When he arrived at his own place, there, sitting at the desk in the front room, was Betty, typing away at the typewriter. Betty, do you remember our postbox on A Street?
Of course, Ray. You want me to go and check on it?
No. Hold all my messages. I need time to think.
Ray, she's in there.
Who?
Mrs. Glenn?
Jesus, Betty, now? In my office? I thought...
I know, but what was I supposed to do? She's grieving.
Ray Rook set his jaw. reached for a cigarette, and wished to God he had stopped in a local soft drink parlor to get a stiff drink before coming back to the office. He brushed past his secretary and entered the room where he saw the dangerous silhouette of Sally Glenn. She was dressed in another silk gown, black as a moonless sky, and seemingly tailored just for her. The fur coat she had worn into the office had been carefully abandoned on a hook by the door. Her hat with the veil remained as the only indication that she was a widow. And by God, she was breathtaking. She turned to look at him as he entered the room, and in an instant, her eyes had him. They might as well have been stars the way they shone in the dim light of the office, pulling him close with their gravity. Mrs. Glenn, I'm sorry to hear about your husband. Rest assured, I'll find out what happened to him.
Please, call me Sally.
Listen, there's nothing for you to do here. Go home.
Mr. Rook, I needed to see you. I don't want to be alone right now.
Sally got up and crossed the room to Ray. He could feel her warmth, a radiant glow in the harsh December gray. Her perfume smelled like citrus and cherry blossoms. The scent of her was deep and inviting. It wrapped its tendrils around Ray's mind and pulled him into her orbit.
I don't feel safe, not knowing what happened to Sam. Do you know?
Ray managed to focus long enough to pull away from her, letting the cigarette smoke trail behind him and form a barrier between them. He opened a drawer in his desk and found the empty bottle again. Cursing under his breath, he looked around and moved to the side table that sat along the far wall in his office. In a small drawer below a tray of glasses was a flask. He opened the top, poured 2 drinks. Handing one to Sally, he clutched his own and said, "Where are your children, Mrs. Glenn?"
Sally, please. They're with my parents. They took them out of town to Seattle last week for a trip, and they haven't come back yet. They don't even know. I didn't know where else to go. I can't be alone in my home right now.
Ray took a drink of his whiskey as he watched the light from the single lamp get caught in the amber glow of Sally's glass. As she moved, the liquid inside the glass rippled and seemed to pull the light underneath it, drowning it. Sally Glenn moved closer to Ray and opened her mouth as if to speak. There was a knock at the door.
Ray, there's a gentleman here to see you. A man of God, Ray.
Ray couldn't pull his eyes away from Sally's. "Well, by all means, Betty, let him in. I might need to confess." Sally was the first to break the spell when she looked away and towards the door. A man entered, slim, mid-50s, and buttoned tighter than a snare drum. He was dressed in the black suit and white collar of a priest. His close-cropped hairline was receding, and his hawk-like features were sharpened by the brutal light inside the office.
Mr. Rook, it seems I have come upon you at a bad time.
Sally had looked behind her to see who had entered the office. When she saw the priest, she seemed to tense up. Ray looked up for a moment and addressed the man who had just come into the office. "Do come in, Mr.
Father Frederich Kelty. I'm here to discuss a rather sensitive matter with you. I was hoping to do so in private."
Ray let his gaze get sucked back into Sally's orbit. Without breaking eye contact with her, he said, "Sure, Father. Let me just escort the lady out and I'll be right with you." Ray put his hand on the small of Sally's back and navigated her towards the door. As she passed Father Kelty, he looked at her but didn't seem to recognize her. Ray grabbed her coat, and opening it for her, she slipped into the outstretched sleeves and leaned into him.
Thank you, Mr. Rook, for finding my husband. I know you'll find what happened. Please let me know the moment you find anything else out.
Sally turned slowly and looked up at him, letting her eyes caress every moment of his face.
I'm entirely at your mercy, Mr. Rook.
She gave a fleeting glance to the Reverend, spun and left the office. Ray called out to his secretary. "Betty, see that Mrs. Glenn has everything she needs, will you?" He turned and entered the office again. "Now then, what can I do for you, Father Kelty?" As you can see, it's a busy evening. Father Kelty settled himself into the leather chair that sat across from Ray Rook's desk.
I know who killed your man at the Scandinavian Bank building.
Ray took out a cigarette and toyed with his lighter, but did not light the end. What man is that?
I know you're tracking down Sam Glenn's killer. I won't speak to the police. They're as corrupt as the criminals in this city. They have no intention of doing God's justice. I need a righteous man, not one filled with corruption and sin.
You may have come to the wrong shop, Father. Ray lit the cigarette and finished his glass of whiskey in front of him. Father Kelty didn't flinch. There was something off about this guy. How did you know about Mr. Glenn?
He was one of my parishioners. He frequented my church often.
Him and his whole family?
Yes, him and the whole of his family. Mr. Rook, this is serious business. I need you to listen.
Ray Rook inhaled deeply and felt his grasp on the glass tighten a bit. The priest, sitting before him, claimed to be close with the Glenn family, but didn't seem to recognize Sally as she walked out of the room. All right, Father. Who killed him?
A degenerate. A low-level criminal and scourge of this city. He goes by the name Vincent. I admit I don't know his last name, but I saw him at the bank building this morning. Early, perhaps 3:30 a.m. He was fleeing the scene, to be sure.
Begs the question, though. What were you doing out on the corner of Pacific at 3:30 in the morning, Father?
I often go down to the alleys of sin in the early morning and look to help those lost souls that find themselves stumbling out into the street after all manner of depravity.
Ray Rook took out his notepad and pencil. You have a particular den of depravity you wait outside of? Father Kelty shifted in his chair, adjusting his collar.
The Ruby Theater. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it sits in the heart of it all.
Ray was familiar with it. The Ruby Theater was one of the most popular stops in the red light district of Tacoma, known as Opera Alley to the men in the city. Billing itself as a low-level vaudeville theater, it attracted those patrons who would enter the respectable front doors of venues like the Pantages or the Grand Tacoma Theater and exit out the back into the alley, where entertainment of a different variety could be found. When they had concluded their business, they could exit through the front door again and appear to all the world as if they were still an upstanding citizen. The Ruby was a special gem, though, in that it sat on top of an underground bathhouse, where you were as likely to get filthy as you were to get clean. It also had a reputation for having some of the best illegal whiskey in town. Let me run this down, Father. If you saw what you think you did, then you can rest easy tonight knowing you've done your civic duty. Father Frederich Kelty stood up and snapped taut as a fishing line that had just hooked a big one. He played ever so lightly with the narrow brim of his hat, fidgeting before he thanked Ray, and moved out of the office.
You are on the path of righteousness, my son. Thank you for doing what's right where others have turned a blind eye.
Father Kelty strode from the room and disappeared beyond the frosted glass of Ray's office. Ray Rook let his hand run across the 5 o'clock shadow that betrayed his lack of sleep. He considered his options for a moment before taking out his Colt. He ejected the clip and made sure it was full. He rammed it back in, chambered a round, and holstered his weapon. Got up, took note of the empty bottle on the desk once more, and exited the office. On his way out, he stopped at Betty's desk. Betty, lock up tonight, will you?
Of course, Ray. Everything okay?
Honestly, Betty, I don't know who's who anymore. I need to go out and see about a priest. He put on his hat and coat and quickly left the building. On the street, he saw Father Kelty scurrying away. He shadowed the priest as he left the building and walked down the street. He made his way quickly up the hill along 9th and then down into Opera Alley towards the Tacoma Daily Ledger building. The newspaper, interestingly enough, was situated in a building that bordered the most corrupt and dark part of the city. Ray was careful to stay a half block behind the priest all along. The long shadows that the evening provided made tailing a mark easier than usual. Father Kelty seemed wrapped up in his own thoughts that evening anyhow. When he arrived at the Ledger, he entered, and Ray lost sight of him. He took out a cigarette and lit it to pass the time. As he inhaled, he tried to find the matching edges of all the pieces that had been handed to him so far. After a few moments, Father Kelty exited the ledger building and made his way down Opera Alley, ducked into a dry cleaner, and disappeared again. Ray was familiar with this place. Beyond the racks of chemically soaked clothes, you could find a bottle of whiskey for a decent price. Ray made a note of it and waited a moment before entering the ledger building. Inside, the noise was deafening. It looked like they were getting ready to print the morning edition. The printing presses whirred in the background. A woman was sitting at the front desk, frantically tapping her typewriter. She looked up when Ray entered the office. He flashed her his best smile.
"Excuse me, doll. My friend should be here. I was supposed to give him this package."
What's his name?
Frederich Kelty. Father Kelty. He's a priest. Hard guy to miss.
You just missed him. He was here to see Mr. Walter.
Ray remembered something. He took out his notepad and flipped back to his conversation with Doyle Farrington, the architect for the Washington building.
Joseph Walter?
That's him.
She pointed to a framed photo of Joseph Walter that hung on the wall of the front office, showcasing the whole staff of the Tacoma Daily Ledger. The brass plate beneath his young, clean-shaven face read, "Reporter."
Do you want me to get him? He should still be in his office.
Ray shook his head.
That's all right, doll. You've been plenty helpful. I can find my friend from here.
Ray Rook left the Ledger office and waited across the street. It was approaching midnight as the man Ray recognized, now as Joseph Walter, exited the Ledger office and walked down the street. Joseph Walter carried with him a large bouquet of roses. Ray followed. Ray Rook found himself in front of a modest wooden door in the center of Opera Alley, where he had seen Joseph Walter enter just moments before. The red light district of Tacoma had been disastrous. What had once been an outlying pocket of a small railroad town had been swallowed up by progress. As the city had expanded, a series of reputable neighborhoods had grown around the darkest part of this. Alongside the door was a show bill pasted to the brick that had a stunningly gorgeous woman with a blonde, short bob framing her dainty features. The name at the top read, Mitze Draper, the tantalizing dance of shame. No man can resist her wiles. Ray smiled to himself. Mitze was back in town. He stared at the show bill for a moment before he swung the door wide and was greeted by a large man wearing a white button-up shirt, black suspenders, and perhaps the stupidest expression Ray had ever seen. He looked like a jackhammer and no doubt had the same versatility. Ray nodded to the slab of muscle dressed like a bouncer, and the man waved Ray back through the heavy crimson curtain that divided the small foyer from the theater floor. The hushed sound of the Ruby Theater lapped against Ray as he entered through the heavy velvet curtains. Tables studded the wide floor. On either side of the theater, private booths with heavy curtains that could be drawn hugged the wall. Along the back wall crouched the stage. A heavily decorated proscenium arch curved up and over the wooden stage. It was carved with all manner of nymphs and satyrs chasing one another in various acts that Ray were certain Father Kelty wouldn't support in public. As he looked around, the lights dimmed for a moment, and the stage roared to life with light. There was Mitze. In a flash, she had exploded like a firecracker back into his life. Ray slid up to the bar, flagged the barkeep down for a whiskey, and watched the show. It had been 3 years since he had seen Mitze last, and she hadn't changed at all. The Dance of Shame was a burlesque number with a series of veils, and Mitze was a master at toying with the imagination. After the show, Ray made his way back to Mitze's dressing room. Her name was in bold letters on the door. He knocked, but no one answered, so he let himself in. The room had the unmistakable scent of lilacs. A large table with a mirror and bare bulbs were against the wall. A variety of increasingly scandalous outfits hung on a rack by the door. On a small table by a shabby chaise lounge, there was a large bouquet of roses. The card, nestled inside the petals, said, "For my darling tomato, your Joe." A moment later, Mitze entered the room. She saw Ray and immediately smiled.
Well, look what the cat dragged in. Let me get a look at you.
She was pure energy. Her blonde hair framed her radiant smile perfectly. The crimson of her lips was almost blinding. She ran across the room and threw her arms around Ray Rook.
Aren't you just a sight for sore eyes?
Hey, doll. Looks like you've got a good thing going these days.
Isn't it fabulous? All this for little old me.
You're worth 10 times this. You're still every bit a dish.
Mitze made as if she were blushing, but Ray knew better than to think she could be so easily flustered. The lilac scent of her perfume was powerful and felt stronger than the whiskey Ray had been drinking during the show. Mitze took out a case of Chesterfield cigarettes, placed one daintily in a long-stemmed Quelizaire, and offered the tip to Ray to light. He eagerly obliged. As she replaced the cigarettes into her small purse, he caught sight of a tiny derringer hidden inside.
Now, I love to see your face, Mac, you know that I do, but you usually bring something dark to my door. Not that I mind.
Mitze inhaled deeply and blew smoke playfully at Ray as she leaned back against her makeup table. The bare bulbs that wreathed the mirror made her silhouette pop, and Ray reached for a cigarette of his own.
Honest truth? Finding you here may just be a windfall.
Maybe you're where you're supposed to be. Be a good bird, won't you, Ray, and step outside for a moment? Let me change, and we can go get a drink.
All right, doll.
Ray exited the dressing room and stood in the hallway. Down the corridor was a dimly lit doorframe. The sign above it read, "To the Baths." As Ray stood looking down the hall at the entrance to the underground bathhouse, he saw Joseph Walter point a gentleman down into the area and duck around the corner. Ray paused a moment to make sure he hadn't been made before he followed him, and when he arrived at the narrow passage at the bathhouse, he heard the first shot ring out and a woman scream. He pulled his Colt 1911 free from its holster and went down to the stairs quickly. 3 more shots, louder than the first, echoed through the bathhouse corridor. The steam inside the bathhouse was stifling. The thick clouds obscured his vision, and the deep white-tiled room was impossible to gauge. Ray could hear a woman screaming at the far end. Men and women in states of half-dress were rushing past him to get out of the thick vapor of the baths. He made his way carefully into the back, where, in the dim light, he could make out a steadily growing pool of blood. There, in the center of the expanding ruby puddle, lay a man. A fresh hole in his chest was the only thing he wore. Ray kept his pistol at the ready as he looked down at the now lifeless face of Father Frederich Kelty. From the mist to his right, the 2 Pinkerton detectives from earlier materialized. Larry Hendelson had his revolver out, and Alan Steele called out to him from behind.
Come on, Hendelson. We have to get after him.
Well, looks like you're in this mess too now.
Larry Hendelson tipped his hat to Ray and turned to pursue his partner up the stairs that exited through the back of the bathhouse and out towards the alley. A bathhouse attendant came running in to see what all the commotion was about. Ray Rook flagged him down.
Call the police. Ask for Chief Detective Charles Byrne. Tell them Ray Rook has something they're going to want to see.
Thank you for joining us for Part 2 of the Tacoma Mini Mystery Series in celebration of Historic Preservation Month. Join us next week for Part 3, Deception at the Gamble House.